Vatican Assassins, Chapter 35, The Jesuits, 1912 to 1915, sinking the death ship Titanic. Lusitania is sure to follow. By the command of God, it is lawful to murder the innocent, to rob and to commit all lewdness, because he, the Pope, is Lord of life and death and all things, and thus to fulfill his mandate is our duty. Pietro Lagona, 1624, Italian Jesuit. There is no record in history of an association whose organization has stood for 300 years unchanged and unaltered by all the assaults of men and time, and which has exercised such an immense influence over the destinies of mankind. The ends justifies the means is his favorite maxim, and as his only end, as we have shown, is the order. At its bidding, the Jesuit is ready to commit any crime whatsoever. G.B. Niccolini, Rome, 1889, Protestant Italian patriot. Why was the true role of J.P. Morgan, the banker and tycoon, who was the real owner of the Titanic, covered up at the American inquiry? How did the Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, who dominated the British inquiry, get away with insider trading in shares of the Marconi Company at the very moment its value was boosted by the key role of Wireless in the rescue, where two of the surviving crewmen who were on watch at or near the bridge of the Titanic when she struck her iceberg bride by White Star to keep their mouths shut, both at the inquiries and long afterwards? What guilty secret did they share? Did the office of the watch ignore 3 earlier warnings of ice from the crow's nest? Amid these and other puzzles, large and small, we cannot forget that the central mystery of the Titanic remains what it has always been. Why did Captain Smith accelerate into an exceptionally large and southerly ice field of which he had been warned repeatedly both before and during his last voyage? We also reassess and throw new light upon many further points, among them the disappearance of the lookout's binoculars, the fire covered up by Captain Smith that raged below in a coal bunker from before the maiden voyage began to within hours of the disaster, the attested reluctance of Chief Officer Henry Wilde to take up his duties, the 55 passenger cancellations, including J.P. Morgan's shortly before departure, the massive alteration to the Titanic's superstructure days before she set sail, and the conundrum of the mystery ships which may or may not have passed from the scene of the tragedy as it was still being played out, raising the possibility that far more than 1 in 3 of those aboard could have been rescued. The perfunctory trials of the Titanic, a pale imitation of the Olympics, were followed by an outbreak of fire in bunker number 10. It could have been dealt with at Southampton, with all a great port's firefighting facilities and without affecting sailing time. Instead, an extra 12 firemen was specially signed on to deal with it at sea. The blaze was concealed from Captain Maurice Harvey Clark, the board, a trade inspector. Why did Smith not have the fire put out as soon as possible? Why did he hide it? Come to that, why did his ship consistently show a slight list to port in a calm sea before the collision, as noted by several aboard? Was there some undeclared damage to account for this? A leak in the weakened stern, for example? Why, after the collision, did Smith run the engine slow ahead for some minutes, as attested by witnesses, a move which would have exacerbated the flooding, the forward compartments? Why was counterflooding not attempted as a means of keeping the ship on an even keel for longer? Why did Dr. Robert D. Ballard find a bulkhead not on his own plan of the Titanic when exploring the wreck? Neither Dr. Ballard nor anyone else who has visited a wreck for pictorial or plundering purposes has produced a single object or photograph of anything showing the name Titanic except on the bow and on one luggage tag. The name is shown on nothing else, both built into the ship and recovered or recorded so far. We found this sufficiently remarkable to invite every likely source to settle the matter once for all by furnishing proof that the wreck was the Titanic. Reactions ranged from amusement via irritation to ridicule and shock that anyone would raise such a question. Our difficulty was that a substitution, far-fetched or no, looked like a promising explanation for so many puzzles. The author, inferring that white stars severely damaged the Olympic, was marginally repaired and sent to sea as the Titanic, that the real Titanic, renamed Olympic, went on to be used in World War I, and that J.P. Morgan benefited from the wreck. But in terms of interest and importance, J.P. Morgan, the real owner of the ill-fated ship, is the outstanding absentee, topping the unusually lengthy list of 55 passengers known to have cancelled their bookings at the 11th hour, including Morgan's business partner and the outgoing ambassador to Paris, Robert Bacon, American steel baron Henry C. Frick, railroad and shipping tycoon George W. Vanderbilt, America's chocolate king Milton Hershey, New York finance magnate Horace J. Harding, and Reverend J. Stuart Holden of St. Paul's Anglican Cathedral in London. He was too ill to sail on the world's most lavish liner, but well enough to reunite with his mistress in Aix-les-Bains, where he was found in excellent health by a reporter just after the ship went down. Asked about the disaster, he indicated extreme distress. He had arrived at the French resort after Nile cruise and visits to Rome and Florence, having conferred with his masters in the Vatican and Borgo Santo Spirito. The news confirming the disaster broke on his 75th birthday, 17 April, imparting to his murderous financial tyrant a most enjoyable birthday. Fortunately, a large part of his art collection, kept in Europe to avoid American import duty, happily eased just as Britain introduced death duties, happened to miss the ship because of last-minute hold-ups in crating. The ultimate owner of the lost ship was thus twice blessed. To him that hath shall be given. From previous chapters, we know the purpose of the Jesuit order, but before we begin to peer into the abyss of the tragedy called the Titanic, involving the largest ocean liner of its time, having been built to be treacherously sunk by the combined thunderbolts of the Olympic Jesuit order, known to itself as the Company of the Perfect, we must review how these mind-controlled soldiering International Marine Corps of Loyola carry out their deeds of blood while under the orders from their Father General. I shall regard myself as a dead body without will or intelligence, as a little crucifix which is turned about unresistingly at the will of him who holds it, as a staff in the hands of an old man who uses it as he requires it and as it suits him best. When the general shall require the perpetration of any crime or the performance of any act, howsoever perfidious or shameless, in all or in any of these cases, the Jesuit shall execute his commands without fear of offense. J.B. Nicolini, in quoting the wicked Jesuit constitutions, writes of the general, no constitution, declaration, any order living can involve an obligation to commit sin mortal or venial unless the superior command in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ or in virtue of holy obedience, which shall be done in those cases or persons wherein it shall be judged that it will greatly conduce to the particular good of each, or to the general advantage of the Jesuit order, and instead of the fear of offense, let love and the desire of all perfection proceed, that the greater glory and praise of Christ, our Creator and Lord, may follow. The Honorable Pennsylvania Congressman E. Joy Morris of Philadelphia, in his remarks against the introduction of the Masonic system and the secret religious orders of the Church of Rome into that Commonwealth, delivered on the final passage of a bill to incorporate the Third Order of Franciscans in Cambria County in a body politic, declares in 1856, just prior to America's war between the states, with what an iron yoke that monastic fraternities are ruled by the superior generals, and how completely individual independence is crushed under such a system, may be understood from the following extract from a work of the Reverend Father Jesuit Xavier de Revenant, De L'existens et Dei, Institute the Jesuits, page 53 and 54. We read at the article, Obedience to Superiors. You shall always see Jesus Christ in the general. You shall obey him in everything. Your obedience shall be boundless in the execution, in the will and understanding. You shall persuade yourself against common conscience that God speaks with his mouth, that when he orders, God himself orders. You should execute his command immediately with joy and with steadiness. You shall penetrate yourselves with the thought that all which he will order shall be right. You shall sacrifice your own will with a blind obedience. You shall be bound at his request to be ready to unveil your conscience to him. You shall be in his hands a dead body, which he will govern, move, displace according to his own will. You shall resemble the stick upon which rests as an old man. They contributed, says Henry Hallam in his Constitutional History of England, in a very material degree, to check the tide of the Reformation, subtle alike and intrepid, pliant in their direction, unshaken in their aim, the sworn, implacable, unscrupulous enemies of Protestant governments. The Jesuits were the legitimate object of jealousy and restraint. As every member of that society enters into an engagement of absolute unhesitating obedience to its superior, no one could justly complain that he was presumed capable at last of committing any crimes that the policy of his monarch, Jesuit general, might enjoin. The general possessed the secret of every member. He knows the character, the inclinations of every member. He is made acquainted with the consciences of all who must obey him, particularly the provincials and others to whom he has instructed functions of great importance. Every year list of the houses and members of the society, the names, talents, virtues, failings, and all are there recorded. And in the words of the general, we have meant for martyrdom, if they be required. The year is 1909. The building of the Titanic has begun at shipyard in Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland. Belfast is a Protestant haven of the Irish and is hated by the Jesuit order. By 1912, nearly 500,000 Ulster Protestants would sign the Ulster Covenant, pledging to defeat the conspiracy to set up a Home Rule Parliament. Ireland is still part of the British Empire, but most of the island will be severed from the British Crown as a result of the Jesuits' World War I. The Panama Canal is in building and will be completed in time to begin its usefulness during the Great War. The company's planned destruction of the Protestant British Empire is at hand and will be completed by the end of the Jesuit general's Cold War. The destruction of the Protestant German Empire, having courageously expelled Loyola's black robes, has already been put in motion with a secret treaty between the Order's agents in France and Russia. The overthrow of the Orthodox Russian Empire has already begun. The Jesuits having provoked the war in 1904 using Emperor Meiji of Japan. The destruction of Imperial Japan is in the making as payback for the Emperor's shogun expelling the Jesuit missionaries for over 250 years. The atrocities of the Jesuits' Bolshevik Revolution and subsequent inquisition by Jesuit-trained Joseph Stalin will be blamed on the Jews, converting the Europeans into unwitting tools of Rome's Third Reich. The Jewish Holocaust will be used to justify Rome's creation of the labor Zionist nation of Israel, paving the way for an even greater burnt offerings of Jews, as the majority of these descendants of Jacob, due to worldwide anti-Jewish fury, are to be driven from the nations to one geographical location, the land of Canaan being necessary to that end. England's General Allenby will take Jerusalem from the Muslim Turks in 1917, enabling Solomon's temple to ultimately be rebuilt for the infallible Pope, the Prince that shall come, Daniel 9:26. To finance this grand design, the Jesuits must put their privately owned Federal Reserve Bank in place before the crusade begins. That bank must be established in the greatest wealth-producing nation on earth, composed of mostly middle-class white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and Baptists known for their honest and upright Protestant work ethic. Remembering that the order has been expelled from Europe, having taken refuge in the Protestant American and British empires, its Masonic tools are in place and ready to obediently execute the plan. But there are those in government and high finance within both empires who are not willing to participate. Their power and fortunes will not be used to this end, so they must be ushered out of this world in the most terrifying way, death by drowning. Amidst the screams, yells, shrieks, wailing and weeping of helpless men, women and children floundering in the North Atlantic, the innocents will plunge over 10,000 feet, 2.5 miles, to their nightmarish doom. Therefore, the White Star Line is created to bring the immigrant traffic, Irish and French and Italian Roman Catholics in the United States pursuant to Rome's plan of making America dominantly Catholic. But the death ship Titanic is built in hated Protestant Belfast to be sunk and will be used to entice 325 of the world's richest and finest to board the unsinkable man-made Leviathan, loaded with an additional 1,900 Protestant and Catholic animals, with the first-class fare being 50,000 Federal Reserve notes. By today's standard, multi-millionaires board the ship, 3 of them Jewish: Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, the head of Macy's department stores, and Freemason John Jacob Astor, a frequent passenger on the White Star Line, a notable American patriot and soldier, and the wealthiest man on board the Titanic. The captain of the ship is Edward J. Smith, the world's greatest pilot and master of the Atlantic waters, seasoned with 26 years on the high seas. Captain Smith, indeed, is one of the Black Pope's unseen and unknown Jesuit temporal coadjutors. This means that he was not a priest, but a Jesuit of the short robe, as the French would call him, serving the order in his profession. He, without will or intelligence, will commit this crime, this shameless and heartless atrocity at the will of his master, who holds him as a little crucifix and who uses him as it suits him best. Edward J. Smith has been required for martyrdom. Departing southern England from the port of Southampton at 12 noon on April 10, 1912, the captain's master had boarded. This handsome and unpretentious young man, who was the agent for the most powerful Jesuit in Ireland, who in turn reported directly to the Black Pope in Rome, Francis Xavier Wentz. The captain's master was a military operative, a stick in the hand of his provincial superior of the Irish province, which province then included Australia, of the Society of Jesus. This man was Francis M. Brown, now in his final years of Jesuit formation and internationally made known once again for our generation by National Geographic in acknowledgement of the video Secrets of the Titanic, released in 1986, the year after Irish Jesuit priest Edward E. O'Donnell discovered Brown's photographic collection in a large metal trunk, calling it to the attention of the editor of the London Sunday Times. Brown, for the purposes of deception and deep cover, was openly and to all appearances merely a photographer for the church, but secretly he was under orders, serving as the Abraham Zapruder by photographing the seafaring limo and its targeted occupants, unwittingly ensnared in his executive action. Born into a prominent Cork family in 1880, Francis Brown was an orphan by his mid-teens, then to be raised by his powerful uncle Robert Brown, the Bishop of Cloyne. Entering the Jesuit novitiate in 1897, Francis underwent his gruesome philosophy instruction from 1903 to 1906 at the infamous Jesuit institution in Chieri, Italy, not far from Turin, at which Battaglione recorded his secret 1825 meeting between Jesuit Superior General Fortis and his assistants, including the future Jesuit General and rebuilder of the Jesuits, Johannes Soroathan. By 1912, Brown was nearly 32 years of age and in his second year of Jesuit moral theology in Milltown Park in Dublin. The Jesuit institution taught the very same registered doctrines that had been publicly condemned and burned by the French Parliament in 1761. Brown would later graduate in 1915 and receive ordination as a Jesuit priest the same year at the hand of his uncle, the provincial Jesuit spiritual coadjutor, the Bishop of Cloyne. Because of the Titanic secret that he carried in his breast, Francis would later be deliberately sent into the heat of the battle as a chaplain, serving with the Irish Guards at 2 of the most horrendous and yet deliberate sacrificial bloodbaths of World War I, the Somme and the Passchendaele. Gassed, wounded 5 times, and declared the bravest man I ever met by Colonel later Field Marshal Montgomery, Brown became most trusted Jesuit of the Fourth Vow, teaching Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises at retreats and preaching all over Ireland. Jesuit Brown obediently served the Black Pope throughout the Second 30 Years' War and Cold War until his death in 1960, 3 years before the murder of JFK. A truth seeker. The plot is thick and the plan is well laid. Lord Brown, one of the island's bishops for over 17 years and acting president of the bigoted National Ecclesiastical College in Maynooth, referred to in a previous chapter and personally known throughout Ireland, purchases a first-class ticket for his nephew Francis. That ticket, number 84, covered the first 2 legs of the Titanic's maiden voyage. The money used to purchase this ticket was supposedly derived from a civil suit whereby the bishop and 6 priests, including his Jesuit nephew and brother Francis, William Francis Brown, were awarded a total of £500 by jury for libel. The publishing defendant had claimed the Most Reverend Lord Bishop, in pursuance of the order's home rule doctrine and quest, had ordered the Catholics of his diocese to dismiss all Protestants in their employ, which of course in pursuant to maxim of canon law as taught at Maynooth College. The bishop also gave his nephew a new camera with which to photograph the entire ship and its passengers, especially the targeted businessmen of immense wealth, resisting the temporal power of the infallible Pope. To effect entry of the priest into every nook and cranny of the ocean liner, the bishop gave a cherished letter of introduction to be presented to a staunch Irish Roman Catholic, the White Star Line's congenial chief pursuer of the ship, longtime fellow officer of Captain Edward Smith, Jesuit temporal coadjutor Halbert W. McElroy. This man had studied for the priesthood, was a member of an order titled Canons Regular of the Lateran. His brother Richard was a priest, and he had signed on the death ship April 9th, the day before she departed Southampton, he would sacrifice his life for the Pope on the Titanic. With the blessing of his bishop uncle, his brother priest William Francis, and his Jesuit provincial master, in accordance with the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, that trust a Jesuit and theological student departs for Southampton, England. He had been under Jesuit formation for 15 years. He is well versed in canon law, familiar with the order's immoral moral theology, and of course, its accursing Council of Trent. He most likely has been administered an oath in the Bishop's Erie Cathedral overlooking Queenstown and its harbor, anticipating the Titanic's final departure for the North Atlantic. Exiting the cathedral, he will fulfill his mission and proceed in utmost silence, following the plan of his provincial master to the letter. He crosses the channel by ferry and boards a night train for London. Arriving in the morning at the order's commercial capital of the world, there he abides for the day and another night with his brother, an eye specialist, Jesuit temporal coadjutor Dr. James Brown. After a delightful breakfast, he departs at 9:45 a.m. on the Titanic special from Waterloo Station to Southampton, arriving at 11:30 a.m. As planned, Tom Brownrigg, another Jesuit temporal coadjutor under orders, is waiting for Brown at the railway station. They meet, exchange greetings, and proceed to the Titanic's first class stateroom A37. Both inspect the dwelling, as it is now the priest's safe house. The Jesuit bids his assistant adieu before Titanic departs at 12 o'clock noon. It is high noon, the ideal time for an assassination plot to begin, and it would be repeated with the arrival of President Kennedy's Air Force One at Love Field in Dallas, Texas, November 22, 1963. Jesuit Brown begins the second phase of his assignment. He has the perfect cover. Disguised as a man of God, he's harmless and unassuming. Proceeding to the chief purser's office, there enjoys the genial friendship of Herbert W. McElroy. Upon presenting the bishop's letter of introduction, Brother McElroy gives the Jesuit access to every inch of the Titanic over the course of April 10th and 11th, 1912. Every room is photographed, every first-class person is recorded, and many in the lower steerages were pictured. Or for the benefit of the Black Pope in Rome, the Jesuit Father Provincial, of which there are only 10 for the American Empire, knows his Jesuit theological student and nephew of the bishop under his abject control, will spend 2 days on the death ship, taking pictures of the passengers, knowing full well their fate. All Jesuit coadjutors will be photographed, from Captain Smith to First Officer Murdoch to Chief Purser McElroy. All will be recorded for posterity. After stopping at the French port in Cherbourg, from which Astor boarded, The video, narrated by Hollywood actor pro-Bill Clinton activist, having aided Janet Renault's bid to be a Florida governor, Martin Sheen, who renamed himself after Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, another darling of the Jesuits, having visited their former novitiate of St. Isaac's Jokes in Wernersville, Pennsylvania, reveals a vacationing priest, Father Francis Brown, caught these poignant snapshots of his fellow passengers, most of them on a voyage to eternity. The next day, the Titanic made a last stop, pausing off of the coast of Queenstown Island. Here, tenders brought out the last passengers, mostly Irish immigrants headed for new homes in America, and here, the lucky Father Brown disembarked. Father Brown caught Captain Smith peering down from the Titanic's bridge, poised on the brink of destiny. The final eye contact between Captain Smith and the Jesuit in the midst of the doomed Irish Roman Catholics and scores of Scandinavian Lutheran Protestants boarding the steamer is indeed a Kodak moment, remembering that according to Jesuit Pietro Alagona, it is lawful to murder the innocent, and according to Jesuit Luis de Molina, priests may kill the laity to preserve their goods. Both of these criminals were fully persuaded in their brainwashed minds that they were righteous in their mayhem. This scene, portrayed with the brush of a Rembrandt or a Thomas Kincaid, would serve as a crushing rebuke to any nation that would give the religiously bombastic Santa Loyola access to their shores. For here is Jesuit treachery at its finest. Jesuit Brown boards the Titanic, photographs the victims, most assuredly briefs Captain Smith concerning his oath as a Jesuit, and the following morning bids him farewell. He takes a snapshot of the somber captain peering down from the bridge along with two crew members probably involved in the plot as the lucky nation disembarks on the 11th of April, while the cheerful greetings of boarding Irishmen fall upon his ear but never reach his heart. Possibly a little red-headed girl runs by and cries with eager optimism, "Good morning, Father." A young man approaches and quietly asks, "Will you hear my confession before I leave, Father?" A man with his large family approaches and quietly asserts, "You have been a good priest to us. We wish you well, Father Brown." And lastly comes Danny, a little orphan boy named after the great Irish ballad Londonderry, who slowly limps forward, tightly holding his mother's hand, with tears in his eyes and for the love of the priest who had been a father to him. While the Jesuit had taught at Belvedere College for 5 years, he whimpers, "Thank you for helping me. Goodbye, Father." Indeed, it was a goodbye forever. Little Danny would perish amidst the horrifying pandemonium of the locked-down, helpless innocents in the Titanic's lower decks. Dear truth seeker, Francis Brown had been a man. His heart would be breaking, but he, like Rodin the Jesuit of The Wandering Jew, is one of the bogus Star Trek, named after past Jesuit General Francis Borgia, as well as the General's present headquarters being Borgo di Santo Spirito in Rome. He's a Jesuit of under extreme oath for this mission. He's a machine in a man's body, the perfect Manchurian candidate to be one of the commanders of the Engineer Corps Sahel. He would slay his own mother to further the worldwide political power of a tyrannical sinner who calls himself the Vicar of Christ. But he's an orphan. He has no affectionate ties to mother and father, so he goes through his religious motion and so passes by as the Titanic docks at Queenstown. A wealthy American passenger offers to pay for the Jesuit's first-class ticket to New York, but he knows he is forbidden. Yet to placate the heretic, he sends the message to his Jesuit superior requesting permission to depart. The answer returned is incriminating. "Get off that ship, provincial." As Father Brown watches the Titanic disappear over the horizon with a fire below in bunker number 10, he has no regrets. He knows the provincial soldiers will do their duty. He also knows the law of the church, and having no fear of offense, is convinced this crime shall be for the greater glory of God, the God who sits in St. Peter's chair. As the death ship steams for the high seas, Bishop Brown and the Jesuit provincial, perched on the highest point of Queenstown within the bishop's cathedral, overlooking the Atlantic, eagerly watch the disappearing Leviathan with glee. Knowing the death of key men thereon will enable the Pope's Federal Reserve Act to pass in time for the beginning of World War I. It is time for a universal vengeance on a heretic and liberal Eurasia that dealt the order its century of disaster, while the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ was taken by British and American Bible-believing missionaries to the ends of the earth. Praise God. On board the ship, the Jesuit Captain Smith knows his duty. He's under oath. There is no recanting. The ship has been built for the enemies of the order. He, after 3 days at sea, with only one pair of glasses for the bridge, propels full steam ahead, 22 knots on a moonless dark night through a gigantic ice field, nearly 80 square miles in size. Despite at least 8 telegrams of warning as well as many other cautions, he refuses to listen, hell-bent on destruction. Upon approaching the iceberg, First Officer William M. Murdoch, another conspirator, had been instructed by the captain what to do. He orders the engines to be thrown in reverse while swinging the ship sharply to the left, its starboard side. Had the captain not reversed his engines, the Titanic would have turned much more quickly the greater the forward motion. This error was a violation of one of the cardinal rules of safety, which is never to turn the ship's broadside at danger. Are we to believe that Captain Smith, the master of his profession, would make such a basic blunder? In addition to steaming full speed ahead to the up-and-coming icebergs he had been warned about. Obviously, he wanted to break the ship in half. This is nothing more than a repeat of Napoleon's performance at Waterloo in Hitler's stage play in Russia. Both dictators deliberately sacrificing their armies, and a preview of the violation of the most basic rules of security in Dallas, Texas in 1963, resulting in President Kennedy's death. The Titanic grazes the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. April 14th, knowing full well the ship's inadequate number of lifeboats and the crew having no boat assignments in case of an emergency evacuation. Captain Smith walks back to the radio room and instructs his officer to send a CQD, then later an SOS. Smith, the Jesuit coadjutor, has fulfilled his intended purpose in obedience to his Jesuit master, Father Francis M. Brown, Jesuit Provincial, pursuant to the Jesuit oath. Amid the innocence of its passengers, the brutal crew begins to evacuate the ship, but the Jewish multimillionaires Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss are forbidden to board a lifeboat. A few hours later, in the midst of a horrors and panic, with the musicians playing the inspirational Protestant hymn of the Welsh people, Nearer My God to Thee, the Titanic splits in half, plunging to the bottom of the ocean. Along with over 1,500 souls, Astor's young second wife survives, and the Jesuits most likely acquire the use of a fortune through their money trust and obedience to their secret instructions. Did not the Jesuits benefit when Harvard's Weidner Library was built with a donation from Titanic survivor Eleanor Weidner? Did not both her husband George and son Harry perish in the disaster, leaving her in charge of the largest fortune in Roman Catholic Philadelphia? Did not the Jesuits benefit by eliminating Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss, as they were in agreement with the Jewish American Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis in opposing the passage of the Orders Federal Reserve Act? Of Brandeis' opposition we observe. In mid-November 1910, several members of the Aldrich Commission went down to the Millionaires Club at Jekyll Island, probably courtesy of Morgan, to work out a specific plan. The expedition included Aldrich, Davison, Vanderlip, Warburg, A. Platt Andrew, and Irish Roman Catholic Ben Strong, now Vice President and Bankers Trust, dubbed the Morgan Man, who as President of the New York Fed contributed to the Orders stock market crash of 1929. Over the next 2 weeks, these men drew up plans for a national system of regional banks led by a central board of private bankers, the Federal Reserve banking system, the Democratic Congress did not agree, and over the next 2 years bring us to 1912 and the sinking of the Titanic. It rejected the Aldrich Plan as giving too much power to private banks. When the Federal Reserve Act finally passed in December 1913, it provided for a governing board in Washington appointed by the president to represent the public interest. Woodrow Wilson thought this mix of public and private interests would give government the upper hand and effectively turn banks into the instruments, not the masters of business and of individual enterprise and initiative. Louis Brandeis disagreed, claiming that there could be no compromise with the devil, that concessions to the big business interests must in the end prove futile. Was not J.P. Morgan the infallible Pope's financial agent with the American Empire and the man who lured these Jews onto the Titanic? The true sponsor of the Federal Reserve Act with his Aldrich Commission was not bonesman and 33rd degree Freemason President William Howard Taft, the servant of Archbishop James Gibbons and the former dictator over the Philippines, as well as the betrayer of his military aide, Major Archibald Butt, having sacrificed him on the Titanic, and avid supporter of the Federal Reserve Act, urging the country to take up seriously the problem of establishing a central bank, according to Gene Strauss in a masterpiece, Morgan, American Financier. This leads the author to believe there were more than 2 Jesuits on board the Death Ship. There were probably at least 10 of the ship's officers and crew who were professed and under extreme oath. There were possibly several Knights of Columbus under the oath of the 4th degree, as well as a few Freemasons loyal to the mark IHS, the seal of the Black Pope. This explains why Jesuit Brown, the direct agent of his Jesuit provincial and trusted nephew of the local Irish bishop, would personally board the vessel. He must have leisurely finalized the plan with his soldiers charging this select group of the ship's yes-men, hired at the last minute as a result of a contrived strike in England, that upon Jesuit Captain Smith's order to abandon ship to quickly lower the inadequate number of lifeboats, less than half full, with only women and children, into the water, while forbidding the men selected money targets from boarding. The poor passengers within the lower levels were to be locked down so as to prevent the order's wealthy victims from escaping the watchful eye and possibly boarding a lifeboat amidst the hysteria and confusion on deck. Jesuit Captain Smith's deliberate sinking of the Titanic was a preview to the sinking of the doomed USS Indianapolis, overseen by the order's CFR member and commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester William Nimitz, along with several devious subordinates, including Captain Oliver Naquin. The ship's captain and patsy, Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, having been the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee of the Combined Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C., must have known too much and was to be silenced, but Captain McVeigh survived one of the greatest disasters in the history of the American Navy. Predictably, in 1968, unable to cope any longer with this mental agony, the innocent and good captain took his life, to the shame and disgrace of the high command of the U.S. Navy, controlled by the Black Pope via his Knights of Malta and high-level Freemasons. To prevent nearby Fridays from responding with help, the distressed players were seen to be white. Party time! When they should have normally been red. It was for this reason that only one of the lifeboats returned to retrieve those freezing in the darkness, as the temperature of those waters were only 28 degrees. Like the selections at Auschwitz, those selected to board the lifeboats would live. Masons and possibly Knights of Columbus, so Catholic action, including Jesuit temporal coadjutors Smith, Murdoch, and McElroy. This leads us to another question. Who owned the White Star Line? For its management was ultimately responsible for choosing the men who would man the ship, and with the money involved in financing those luxury liners, the Titanic, Britannic, and Olympic, only select Knights of Malta and the modern-day Knights Templar, select Shrine of Freemasons, the great men and the merchants of the earth, Revelation 18:3 and 23. Could have been the movers and shakers on this attack on the private fortunes of wealthy Jews, enjoying the blessings of Protestant Calvinist liberty secured by William I of Orange, Oliver Cromwell, and George Washington, as well as Otto von Bismarck. The knights knew that the Hebrews of both the American and British empires had never suffered formal persecution for over 200 years, and as a result invested their wealth in great industries, bringing financial prosperity to both Protestant peoples. About the time of Titanic, the renowned composer Gustav Mahler, directing the Vienna Court Opera and having composed his immortal and magnificent Symphony No. 5 at Adagietto, abandoned Roman Catholic Austria and settled in New York City in 1909 to enjoy Protestant liberty while conducting the New York Philharmonic as a Jew. 30 years later, his symphonies were banned by Rome's Nazis as degenerate Jewish music. Indeed, the Bible is still true. The pre-incarnate Son of God declaring to the nations his promised response to their treatment of his servant Abraham. Later reaffirmed to Isaac and finally to Jacob, including his 12 sons and their physical descendants, the house of Israel. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. For he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. Zechariah 2, verse 8. For I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. Malachi 3, verse number 6. So the Jesuit general used his papal knights to essentially destroy this happy relationship between American Protestants, Baptists, and Jews, as he created his monstrous international monopoly Federal Reserve Bank. One of his Masonic Knight Templars was the multimillionaire John Morgan. This evil and sinister man, then operating one of the largest banks in the world, would be responsible for the suppression of Nikolai Tesla's brilliant inventions, including worldwide free energy, according to Anthony C. Sutton in his Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. After Morgan's death in 1913, a portion of his massive wealth invested with the American International Corporation, AIC, in New York, now the American International Group, AIG, headed by CFR honorary vice chairman and director Maurice R. Greenberg, would finance the Bolshevik Revolution, that Jesuit Inquisition in Orthodox Russia. According to an arts and entertainment documentary video, this J.P. Morgan, his International Mercantile Marine IMM, having financed the White Star Line and thus the building of the Titanic, had designed a cabin specially furnished and reserved for himself. Suite B-52, previously assigned to steel band Henry C. Frick, his promised presence serving as bait for those marked for death. And at the last moment, just prior to the Titanic's departure from Southampton, this spiritual bastard canceled his reservation, citing ill health, in addition to 54 other men of wealth or power. But with inside information, abandoned his friend and president of IMM, J. Bruce Ismay, the disgraced American scapegoat, who later was fired from his job after managing to survive his intended death by jumping into a lifeboat and returned to New York on another ship. We wonder if Bishop Brown and Freemasonic Morgan threw a party and toasted the temporal power of the infallible Pope as they viewed the Jesuit priest's pictures of the murdered men of wealth and power. The net worth of the Titanic's passengers being over $500 million in 1912. In fact, of J.P. Morgan's obvious gaiety while recuperating after the world's worst maritime disaster, we read, Morgan, it will be recalled, pleaded illness as his excuse for not joining the ship's first and last voyage. 2 days after the Titanic sank, he was found by the American press at the Grand Hotel in the French spa of Aix-les-Bains, where he was taking the waters. He was in excellent health and in the company of his French mistress. Another high-level Freemason who also canceled his reservation on the Titanic was Milton Hershey, Pennsylvania's chocolate king. He had much to gain as American soldiers would be issued Hershey chocolate, on which they would fight the Jesuits' Second 30 Years' War, bankrolled by their Federal Reserve Bank. Other white Masonic Gentiles who canceled their reservations at the last minute were Robert Bacon, Morgan's former business associate Henry C. Frick, America's steel baron, and George W. Vanderbilt. America's railroad and shipping tycoon whose family's 1895 breakers mentioned facing the Atlantic Ocean in Newport, Rhode Island is now controlled by the order via the Knights of Malta. As usual, the Sons of Loyola got away with mass murder and grand theft once again, as their power in the American and British empires was controlling. In spite of a most revealing Senate hearing at New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the former palace, for all the Archbishop's dinner parties, not a soul was prosecuted. The Senate's investigation and another by the British Board of Trade found an appalling series of human and technical errors, but brought no charges against ISME or the IMM. Private damage claims against White Star amounting to $16 million were eventually settled out of court in 1916 for $664,000. Further, concerning American Senator William Alden Smith's investigation, we read and are reminded of the fictional Warren Commission. In his most important case, given Smith's antitrust posture and his claim to independence at the outset, his investigation was a cover-up, an attack on the British, in part a diversion. The masking of American involvement in the considerable person of J.P. Morgan and his almighty interests was a lie by omission. Dear truth seeker, the Jews had dared to block the creation of the Jesuits' Federal Reserve Bank, by which the order would finance World War I and World War II, Rome's second 30 Years' War, including Europe's Jewish Holocaust, made possible by the chairman of the papacy's IBM Freemason Thomas J. Watson, the friend and brother Freemason of Hitler's economic minister Hjalmar Schacht. There's another victim of this plot, usually overlooked and yet a most famous man who perished on the death ship. He was an English Mason, William T. Stead, the journalist who exposed the company's traffic in English prostitutes, described as scholar, dreamer, humanitarian, the greatest and most notable man on board the Titanic, famous all over the world, the personal friend of more living and dead monarchs than any private citizen on earth. We marvel at his apparent courage. London was rotten with the leprosy of white slavery. Nobles, members of parliament, dukes, lords, all were in great traffic in young girls. Spiritualist William T. Stead saw and knew. Stead had found indisputable evidence of what he wished to prove. He knew that power was against him, that money was against him, and that corruption was against him. Bit by bit he gathered his testimony. Name after name was secured. And then, one morning in 1885, the blow that changed England's morals fell. London awoke to stare, to gasp. Stead had called his exposure the maiden tribute to Babylon, and there was truth to back every statement. Stead was arrested. He was thrown into prison on the charge that he had committed an infraction of the laws. But he only smiled. He knew that he had won, that Parliament would be forced to pass a law that would wipe out the white slavery, and Parliament did. The sinking of the Titanic was not only necessary in establishing the order's Federal Reserve Bank, it was the beginning of the destruction of America's real economic wealth, so characteristic of Bible reading, hard-working, moral, inventive, courageous, ruggedly individualistic, white middle class Protestant nations. If the order was to succeed in its counter-reformation attack on the West, private wealth must be cleverly taken from Protestants and given to the order's papal knights and occult masons intending to rule corporate America. Of this coveted and yet detested Protestant economic prosperity, evident not only in America under President McKinley, but in England during the reign of Queen Victoria. We read in 1899, "It is Protestantism which, by God's help, has been the cause of England's prosperity and of that of all other white Protestant countries, while Roman Catholic countries which acknowledge papal supremacy are everywhere going down in the scale of nations. Protestant countries are everywhere growing in prosperity. The Protestant nations are at the head of the world in everything which make nations truly great and glorious. We have therefore no reason to be ashamed of the word Protestantism. This horrible tragedy, rivaling Shakespeare's King Lear, could have been prevented had both the British and American governments been doing their biblical duty of punishing evil, had the English crown expelled the Jesuits and Knights of Malta, even as Queen Elizabeth I had done in the 16th century, and had the Masonic lodges been closed, even as Cromwell had done in the 17th century, the heartbroken Irish Catholics and Protestants, whose sons and daughters were sacrificed by Ireland's Jesuit master Francis M. Brown, would have never shed their Titanic tears over lost loved ones, further staining the pages of Irish history. Oh, beware of the Ides of April. Titanic was sunk on April 15th, the same day Lincoln had called out troops on the Protestant South, the same day Lincoln died at the hand of his Jesuit-controlled assassin, and at the same day all 14 Amendment citizen serfs of the Jesuit general's Holy Roman American Empire make their annual confessions to the Pope's privately owned Internal Revenue Service, pursuant to the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, ruled by demon-possessed Pope Innocent III. Indeed, the code of law governing the American Empire had been modeled after the code of law governing the Pope's Vatican Empire. If the Jesuits would sink a ship full of people just to get to one man, would they not do the same with an airplane? Was it not a coincidence that Congressman Larry P. McDonald on board flight KAL-007, the lucky 33rd degree Freemason Senator Jesse Helms, having boarded the untargeted sister flight in Alaska and would later drop the investigation in 1992, was supposedly shot down by a Russian Su-15 jet fighter in 1983 as he was calling for a congressional investigation of the Council of Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission? Is it not obvious as to why President Ronald Reagan, the mere slave to Nader Malta and CIA Director William J. Casey, refused to retaliate against the Soviets, Casey knowing full well the aircraft had been fitted for destruction at Andrews AFB with a radioactivated bomb, that KAL-007 was blown up by a nearby U.S. intelligence station and sunk 400 miles south of the official wreckage area, killing 269 innocents. Was it not a coincidence that John F. Kennedy Jr. lost control of his aircraft, having had its tail internally blown off, and plunged into the Atlantic Ocean, killing his wife and sister-in-law, all three bodies being full of shrapnel, according to Cincinnati radio host and Baptist pastor Ernie Sanders, as he sought to find his father's real killer? As a possible U.S. Senator from New York, a multi-millionaire, successful publisher, and loved by the people, he would have solved the crime of the century. There are no accidents. Through such tragedies like the deliberate sinking of the USS Indianapolis during World War II, the Jesuit order benefited and had the power to cover it up with their key men responsible for investigating the murders. We also must conclude that somehow the Jesuit order absorbed the fortunes of the wealthy for its use in destroying the Protestant Reformation while reducing the nations to serving dictators loyal to the Pope, who in turn hate the Jews. Years later, the Jesuits controlling the Jesuit Theater, or Hollywood, the wood from which magic wands were made, through their Masonic Jewish labor Zionists, would release the most expensive and profitable movie of all time, commemorating their great sacrifice in the North Atlantic to their God who sits in St. Peter's chair. That movie was Titanic. A previous movie had also been released, reenacting another one of their keystone human sacrifices in North America. That movie was JFK Director's Cut. Dear Truth Seeker, if we do not learn our lessons from the past, including the deliberate wrecking of the Titanic, we are doomed to repeat them with more national tragedies like the stock market crash of 1929, America's Titanic, the Kennedy assassination, the Watergate scandal, the Iran-Contra affair, the Whitewater fiasco, the Chinagate scandal, Opus Dei's Justice Department having dropped 58 counts against the guilty Chinese intelligence operative, Dr. Wen Ho Lee, thereby concealing the high treason of the orders CIA, which boldly gave America's most classified thermonuclear warhead secrets to the bloody red Chinese, and now the attack on the World Trade Center and a Pentagon. For the Black Pope is the god of the society, and nothing but his electric touch can galvanize their dead corpses in a life in action. Until he speaks, they're like serpents. coiled up in their wintry graves, lifeless and inactive. But the moment he gives the word or command, each member springs instantaneously to his feet, leaving unfinished whatsoever may have engaged him, ready to assail whomsoever he may require to be assailed, and to strike wheresoever he shall direct the blow to be stricken. Jesuit General Seal over the novitiate of St. Isaac Joe, 1930. Hollywood actor Martin Sheen's summer visit at Wernersville, Pennsylvania, St. Isaac Joe's Jesuit Center for Spiritual Growth, 1990s. During a hush-hush, no press visit, Martin Sheen, a pro-Jesuit theater actor, socialist Democrat, and a Clinton activist, now a prominent defender of Mexican aliens, most being Roman Catholics loyal to the Pope's American hierarchy, illegally residing within the western United States, toured a former novitiate with Jesuit Patrick Kelly, far left, and Jesuit actor Michael Kennedy, far right. We must remember that Nada Malta Joseph P. Kennedy was one of the founding fathers of America's silver screen. Shipping tycoon and Nada Malta Skoros was once the head of the 20th Century Fox. Hollywood is truly the Jesuit theater, cleverly revealing the order's past, for which reason Sheen was chosen to narrate secrets of the Titanic. House party at the Harcourt's Newnham Park, 1907. Seated in the center is King Edward VII, 1901 to 1910, the Black Pope's most powerful Freemason over his British Empire. Standing on the stairs, fourth from the top, is John P. Morgan, the Black Pope's most powerful Freemason in his Holy Roman 14th Amendment American Empire. Both men were beholden to the dictation of the company, English Jesuit Bernard Vaughan being one of several. The King and Morgan were intimate friends and mutually ruthless. Edward, while the Prince of Wales, covering for the murders of artist Walter Sickert, alias Jack the Ripper, and Morgan, having caused the four major U.S. financial crises from 1873 to 1893. In 1907, both men, in ruling their national banking empires, caused America's greatest financial panic, leading to the secret drafting of the Federal Reserve Act at George's Jekyll Island by Morgan agent Henry P. Davison. Aware of the conspiracy to monopolize the nation's credit into the hand of James Cardinal Gibbon's Morgan-ruled empire, Jewish Freemason John Jacob Astor and others resisted the plot. The remedy was to send Astor to his grave on the Titanic, on possibly the damaged Olympic, the ensuing American and British investigations to serve as mere cover-ups. Neither Edward VII nor Morgan lived to see the creation of the Orders Federal Reserve Bank, which, with the Pope's Masonic Bank of England, financed World War I. Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, 1912. John Astor, a veteran of the Spanish-American War and the wealthiest man on board the Titanic, was a disobedient Jewish Freemason who resisted the orders John P. Morgan and thus the Roman Papal Caesar in Satan's Vatican Palace. The target of the Black Pope, John Jacob Astor IV, 1912. John Jacob Astor IV, with his second pregnant young wife, Madeline, who later gave birth to his son, John Jacob Astor VI, was the target of the Jesuit order, manning the Titanic. Astor and later Supreme Court Justice Louis de Brandeis resisted the establishment of what became the American Empire's J.P. Morgan-backed socialist communist cartel capitalist central bank, privately controlled by Papal Knights of Malta and Shrine of Freemasons on behalf of the Black Pope. It was the thieving King's Bank, the Federal Reserve System. Masonic son Vincent inherited 200 million, joined the CFR and served the orders FDR. English journalist Freemason William T. Stadd, 1849 to 1912. Pictured above, with his wife, William Stadd, was universally mourned upon his death, having perished at the command of the Black Pope. Born in poverty to an accursed congregational heretic minister in Northumberland, England, Stadd developed an iron will, having to support the family at age 14 upon his father's untimely death. Through years of toil, dauntless determination, and providential blessings, Stead rose from being an errand boy earning 12 cents a week to the virtual editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. With London rotten with the leprosy of white slavery, Stead single-handedly exposed the corruption with his epic work, The Maiden Tribute to Babylon, forcing Parliament to pass a law in 1885 wiping out underground compulsory prostitution, secretly beloved by the nobility and those in power, including Jesuit-controlled Prince of Wales and the Prime Ministers. Stead, a theosophist and a spiritualist, was involved with 33rd degree Freemasons Cecil J. Rhodes and Lord Alfred Milner in creating what Georgetown University's Jesuit-controlled historian and mentor of Bill Clinton, Carroll Quigley, called the Round Table Group, later to become the Order's Royal Institute of International Affairs, 1919, but Stead was expelled from the group for opposing the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, which destroyed the heretic Dutch Protestants and stole their gold mines of the Transvaal. Though Stead's later masterpiece If Christ Come to Chicago further enhanced his world fame, he did not escape the invisible, silent, avenging hand of Satan's black robes. Jesuit coadjutors William M. Murdoch and Edward J. Smith, 1912. Captain Smith, on the right, posing with his first officer, privy to the plot, kept the Order's wealthy Jewish targets from boarding the partially filled lifeboats. Titanic's guilty Captain Smith about to depart, 1912. As the Jesuit Francis M. Brown disembarked from the Titanic and returning to the Black Pope's Irish province, he took this final snapshot of Captain Smith peering down from the bridge. The eye contact between the Jesuit and the death ship's pilot betrayed the oath-bound duty the captain would fulfill. Condemned Irish immigrants ready to board the Titanic, 1912. This approaching ferry during the Titanic's last stop at Queenstown Island was loaded with happy, optimistic Irish immigrants headed for Protestant America. Doomed Irish Protestants and Catholics boarding the Titanic, 1912. Taken by Brown himself, this most pitiful photograph shows condemned Irishmen, mostly Roman Catholic, boarding the doomed Titanic with the full knowledge of Brown's merciless Jesuit provincial under extreme oath. Cleverly, the lucky priest got off the ship before the Titanic departed, knowing its final destination would be at the bottom of the freezing North Atlantic Ocean. Jesuit of the Irish province, Francis M. Brown, 1880 to 1960. Francis M. Brown, nephew of Ireland's Bishop Brown and disciplined agent of the Jesuit Provincial of Ireland, subject to the Black Pope, is most accurately described by the converted G.B. Niccolini of Rome in 1889 when he keenly wrote the history of the Jesuits. Their evil genius is constantly present and active. RMS Titanic departs with the cream of American society, 1912. As the death ship set out to meet its predetermined destiny, the obedient sons of Loyola on board had no regrets, for the sinking of the Titanic was in the motto of the order, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God. It was in fact for the further extension of the temporal earthly power of the Black Pope's infallible God on earth, who sits in the Vatican St. Peter's chair. Francis Brown, Bishop Robert Brown, William Brown, 1920s. These are the savage killers, the merciless monsters fraught with deception and treachery, brainwashed with Ignatius Loyola's satanic spiritual exercises, so as in the name of holy obedience to silence every twinge of conscience sparked by unspeakable crimes against the Most High God. Francis Patrick Mary Brown, the youngest of 8 children, orphaned in his teens and raised by his uncle, the Bishop of Cloyne, Robert Brown, entered the Jesuit novitiate in 1897 at the age of 17. By 1912, the Jesuit was in his first year of moral theology, fully imbibed with the maxim of Aquinas, it is no murder to kill a heretic. Given a camera and a first-class ticket by his uncle to photograph the entirety of the Titanic, Brown spent a day and a night on the death ship, capturing last movements of targeted first-class passengers, as well as the Dublin Provincial's Jesuit temporal coadjutors required for martyrdom, including Captain Edward Smith, First Officer Murdoch and Chief Purser McElroy, befriended by a wealthy American first-class passenger offering to pay his way to New York, Brown petitioned his superior for permission to travel, knowing full well the doom of the ship. The reply was, "Get off that ship, Provincial." Jesuit Brown departed at Queenstown and returned to the cathedral to the delight of his brother, Jesuit William, 1876 to 1938, and his bishop uncle plotting to realize Irish home rule. British warship and passenger liner HMS Lusitania, 1915, with the Jesuit general now in complete command of both the American and English governments. Through high-level Freemasonry, he sought to create an incident whereby his international press could incite the American people to enter World War I. The Lusitania was not only a floating palace of comfort, but was also listed as an armed merchant cruiser, sporting 12 6-inch guns. Underway from New York on May the 1st, the German government had warned all passengers to board at their own risk, as German submarines would sink her if encountered. Cunard Line steamer, under the jurisdiction England's Lord of Admiralty, Masonic Winston Churchill, had been loaded with 5,000 3-inch artillery shells, 6 million .303 caliber rifle bullets, an additional 200 tons of ammunition from the dock Queen Margaret, and a massive amount of gun cotton, which explodes upon contact with water. The ship's captain was the brave and seasoned William Turner. Little did he know he would be Churchill's scapegoat. On May the 7th, the Lusitania arrived 14 miles off of the coast of Ireland. Its escort, the cruiser HMS Juno, having withdrawn, unbeknown to the captain. Receiving coded messages from the Admiralty, Turner promptly obeyed and thus moved his ship into perfect position for the awaiting German U-boat. One torpedo hit the steamer, causing a monstrous secondary explosion. The Lusitania sinking in a mere 18 minutes. Over 1,200 people, including 128 Americans, lost their lives, and Captain Turner was unfairly blamed. Although the Germans made reparations to America, the Jesuits used this propaganda to ultimately, in 1917, bring the American Empire into the Pope's Second 30 Years' War. History of the World War, an authentic narrative of the world's greatest war. Francis A. Mott, Chicago, John C. Winston Company, 1919, page 259.